The opening episode of The Home Ground. We're peeling back the complexities and layers, the multifaceted layers of the property industry with Max Schiffman. Max, happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's my birthday when we're recording. Probably
Yes.
won't be when we release, but it's nice to be celebrating with you guys today.
No, and looking very much forward to our chat with Andrew Westacott, one of Australia's leading sports executives, in the second part of the show.
Yeah, it's a privilege to have Andrew on. He's a wealth of knowledge and experience and happens to be the CEO of a sport that I love, or former CEO, I should say.
Yeah, you're going to be a truth seeker of Australian property and sport and the nexus between the two. So I'm looking forward very much to talking to experts in the industry, but also getting your view on a range of things, including the federal election, historic win for Labor on the back largely of a very progressive housing policy. How did you see the policy? Why was it so much different to the coalitions as gaining traction in the electorate, do you think?
Well, it was a housing election, and it was certainly one of the major conversation pieces, and there were a lot of announcements from all sides around housing. But I guess I need to ask you, Bash, you're not in the housing space. How did you perceive it? What were the things that you picked up through the campaign?
I thought their messaging was direct. I thought, obviously, ambitious. Their targets were ambitious, and only time will prove whether they can actually achieve these goals. But the messaging was direct. It was targeted towards first home buyers, making housing more affordable, in theory. Let's see, and let's watch the space to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. Certainly my perception of the campaign was Labor was much, much better at selling that vision. Now, whether the vision happens, I'm not so sure yet, and I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit. But they were very good at understanding the demographics they were speaking to, and they were much better, I think, at talking to the younger people who were feeling the most alienated around their ability to get into housing one way or another.
Yeah, what about that? Obviously, the 5% deposit was a big one, but what interested me was the 100,000 homes for the first home buyers within 8 years. Do you reckon that's achievable given what you've seen?
Look, I think a target is a good thing in principle, but I always bring it back to what you do to actually reach the target, because just saying you want to do something and doing nothing to get there isn't really helpful to anyone. I think the 100,000 is a more attainable target than the 1.2 million they've been talking about. They're going to build, which is a bit laughable, simply because there are so many things that are impacting the industry now that are preventing us from delivering new supply, and the biggest issue is the cost of development. Which is something that hasn't really been tackled through the election campaign, isn't being tackled by the states either. And as long as that remains a barrier, it's going to limit how much housing you can deliver. Now, there's a lot of detail to come out around the 100,000 homes, but 100,000 homes over 8 years is 12,500 a year, and they're talking about an average call it investment of $100,000 to make it available to a first home buyer. And that could do a lot of good if it's invested the right way. It could be grants, it could be used to unlock enabling infrastructure in certain areas, it could be helping some of the state and territory governments to unlock land supply that they already have and make it available for development. I think where it'll fail is if they force it to be high density, very expensive development, because even $100,000 contributed towards the development of those things, is still going to end up with a really expensive product for a lot of people. So it's going to be important in the crafting of the detail to make sure that it opens up as many housing opportunities as possible.
So Max, are you talking about government incentivised stimulus, basically in the 100,000?
Yeah, it could well be. I mean, obviously it's very targeted towards first home buyers, but you'd want to have as broad an application as possible to maximise the chance of getting to those numbers, and possibly even more. I mean, $100,000 per dwelling is actually quite meaningful if it's applied to the right types of dwellings and the right types of measures. So, I'm keen to work with government to make sure they make the right decisions. I hope they listen to the right people.
Yeah. What about a more macro view whereby private investment is needed, development and so forth? So what we need there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is prices to go up to match the cost build, the build, the cost of building new dwellings to stimulate investment. But in doing so, it shuts out a whole range of buyers, doesn't it, potentially?
Yeah, it's a really perverse situation we find ourselves in at the moment, because at a national level, and it varies a little bit between the states and geography, but essentially the cost of an established dwelling is substantially less than the cost of replacing that dwelling in a lot of places. And as long as that gap is there, it's kind of irrational for a buyer to go and buy something new, because they have to wait and they don't know exactly what it looks like, and they've got to have also a premium to buy into that product when they can buy something that's not that old, or has a different utility nearby, but that already exists. And new housing, by definition, has to cost more than old. It's got newer stuff, it's got high regulations, it'll perform better thermally, so there's going to be a cost impost. But at the moment, that gap is just too big in a lot of cases. And so, to your point, you need prices to rise a little bit more in the established market to make new housing more feasible at scale again. But it also makes it even harder to get in the first place. So that's where things like these measures around the guarantees on deposits might help, because they're being uncapped. That's where potentially a shared equity scheme, which is one of the other policies, could help. But ultimately, and unfortunately, as long as state and federal governments aren't trying to do everything to reduce the cost of development, which they're not, it's only one way. It has to go up and become more expensive to buy in future.
Yeah, and the global demographia study, I hope I've got that right, has had two categories: severely unaffordable and impossibly unaffordable. Most of the capital cities in Australia, they've categorised in the latter, and that must be a real concern.
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, we're at a point now where median income earners cannot afford to buy a house in most parts of our major cities, and that's highly, highly concerning for the country and for our cities. And you're already seeing a small example of that in Sydney, where young people or people that are forming families are effectively forced to move out because they can't find anything relatively affordable. And that's because they have less land available for things like greenfield development than, say, some of the other states. And so sadly, you look at a place like Victoria, which has lots of land, it's choosing to sort of create the same set of circumstances by forcing a lot of high density development, which is very, very costly for people. And it's just not going to meet the criteria for a lot of buyers who want to get into housing, but at a certain price. So, as I said, I think there's stuff that states and territories and the federal government could do to try and reduce the cost of development. There's only a limit to how much they can do that, because labour costs a certain amount and you need a certain amount of materials to build things. But if we don't tackle that at a macro level, we're going to find that we keep shooting up those rankings.
Is there been enough work done on reimagining the Australian house? In other words, different materials, different sizes, a different view of the way we look at housing in this country?
Well, Australian standards are very high in terms of not necessarily in terms of the build quality itself, but certainly in terms of sizing and orientation. And there are limits to how small you can make things. Now, on the one hand, we have some of the biggest homes in the world, but on the other hand, if you wanted to make a more attainable or a smaller unit, you're actually prevented in a lot of cases because of the overriding legislation. When you've travelled the world, you've seen places like Paris where everyone's living in studio apartments. I mean, we couldn't even build a lot of those things if we wanted to in Australia, but they actually are a more affordable product around the world.
Oh, look, I've stayed in a cube apartment in Tokyo where they literally, it's like a coffin. They wheel you in and they push you out. So it's not that comfortable. A little bit of wriggle room is required, but it's not there.
Yeah, well, and look, I don't want to put everyone into, coffin-style cubicle housing either. But sometimes that's a better option than living on the streets, for example. And at the moment, you're prevented from doing even those sorts of more novel things. So I don't know about you, but I think we need to be more flexible with what we allow in terms of housing.
Absolutely. And I don't believe, in a macro sense, we're using some of our natural resources in the best possible way in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that can be done. But there is land available around our cities that's not being used. And sometimes I think it just comes down to ideological attachment to how people think you should live as opposed to what people actually want.
But Max, there's a lot of finger pointing and, you're a truth seeker. You love cutting through all the bullshit. Who needs to take control in this debate in housing and the way it needs to be structured moving forward?
Look, the three levels of government in Australia don't help because you end up with a lot of finger pointing. A federal government having an interest is important, but ultimately most decisions are made by the state governments, and they're the ones that have to get into line, and they have to realise that this crisis is not going away. In fact, it's getting worse. And what do you do in a crisis? You act swiftly and you act accordingly. And I don't think they're acting that way yet. So it only seems like it's going to get worse before it gets better.
But does local government get a bad rap? In a sense, there's a lot of current affairs stories around, councils who either sit on planning permits or let everything through, either one or the other. Do they get a bad rap in the progression of housing in Australia?
I think it's too easy to say no to stuff. It's really, great for a media article to have someone with their arms folded, standing in front of a building going, I don't want to have apartments here or whatever. I mean, I saw something in Canberra recently where they want to say an old dishevelled shopping strip shouldn't get developed into 4-story apartments and the thing's barely standing. So there's just this, conservatism and a lack of desire to see change. And that prevents a lot of progression. But it's not the only reason. I think some councils are fantastic and others are terrible. So it really does vary with how seriously they take some of those more significant targets and obligations on. They can be really good or they can be really, really poor.
You talk about change. Our first guest, he's been an agent of change, hasn't he?
Certainly has, and he's had to navigate some pretty bolshy residents at points during his career, but did a fantastic job of it. And it's going to be amazing to hear from Andrew Westacott in a moment.
It's great to have one of Australia's leading sports executives with us, Andrew Westacott. Andrew, 17 years with the Australian Formula One Grand Prix, 13 as CEO. How do you reflect on your time there?
Oh, David, it's lovely to be here. I reflect on it with a lot of pride, a lot of fun and enjoyment, and a lot of satisfaction to see that Oscar Piastri and the youngsters through the karting around Australia are just going to take it to the next level and securing the event till 2037 in Melbourne and having MotoGP down at Phillip Island. They're great legacies. I love running sports events and I love tourism and I love what it does for the state. So a lot of pride.
Just before you left, you secured that long-term deal with the Victorian government. So it was pivotal, wasn't it? There was a lot of competition for the Grand Prix. It brings so much benefit to the state, but internationally there were the wolves at bay, weren't there?
Yeah, and internationally and also in Australia, you've got to take your hat off to Adelaide because I think they were pioneers in 85. They had the event from 85 to 95. Melbourne came along and a bit of complacency in South Australia, and they now know what major events do for their state because they're doing it really well. But Melbourne came along, got the event in 1996, and in the renegotiations, there was a lot of competition from across the border in Sydney, and you can't lose these events because if you do, you'll never get them back. And they, whilst some people might say it's a lot of money in that one-off occasion, when you stack it up against Olympic Games, FIFA World Soccer Cups, Commonwealth Games, they pay for themselves many, many times over. So great to have it here and great to have it secured till 2037.
Yeah, how hard do you really think the New South Wales government was going? Because you hear a lot of stories around wanting to bring the race over. Do you think they were legitimately in the conversation?
Oh, absolutely. They were legitimately in the conversation. They had a real crack. I think ultimately the proposition that Melbourne had in being a proven delivery partner of Formula One and proven over sort of nearly 3 decades now, to have that city location, which is so important at Albert Park, just 5 kilometres or so from the CBD, is what Formula One wants these days. It's destination locations, it's wanting vibrancy, it's wanting something unique. And Melbourne has something unique in that parkland setting with 150,000 people, but a spread of corporates, grandstand, general admission and families, and it does it beautifully well. And the season opener this year is the place where it should be.
Andrew, you oversaw the MotoGP at Phillip Island, but let's focus on the Formula One at Albert Park. That balance between the cooperation from local government, state government, a little bit of federal, and keeping it relevant for the residents as well. How difficult was that balance?
Oh, in the early days, it was pioneering, but it needed to happen because Joan Kerner in the early 90s, she created the Melbourne Major Events Company. And then Ron Walker was the first chair, and then there was a Labor government, they were ousted, and Jeff Kennett came in. So it was really Joan Kerner who created it, but then Jeff Kennett came along with Ron Walker, and they realised that you needed a major event strategy to deliver tourism, to deliver revenues into the state of Victoria. So they went out and got MotoGP, they got Formula One, they got the President's Cup, and now we've had it 3 times. It'll be 4 and 5 times in future years. FINA World Swimming Championships, they all came to Melbourne, and then cities throughout Asia and throughout the Middle East copied this footprint. But one thing I'll pick you up on, it was very much a Victorian strategy. So when Formula One came to Melbourne, that was Victorian money and Victorian taxpayers' money. So it was a real step into the unknown a little bit to have state government funding to go in to something that you acquire like a Formula One event.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that Victoria now leads in terms of that event and sporting calendar across the nation. And it's probably an unassailable lead in many ways, but one that takes a lot of investment, doesn't it? And so one of the things we often hear is there's so much being invested in the Formula One, but you're probably in a unique position to be able to explain just how much benefit we actually achieve from it.
Yeah, well, the numbers keep going up and up in terms of the benefits to the state. But I guess you look at a couple of areas, and you can go back as early as 1956 with infrastructure and legacy. And Melbourne have done it just unbelievably well. The Olympic Games at the MCG, the Bow Repair Swimming Pavilion, which is still there and used by the Collingwood Football Club. The investment into the Melbourne Olympic Parks area that now stages the Grand Slam tennis tournament, has obviously for many years since it moved out of Kooyong and on the grass. I mean, the infrastructure investment there sets Melbourne ahead, and it's now used year round. The investment at Albert Park is the same thing, but it's actually used on a one-off basis. But the benefit will be when they upgrade the pit buildings, as they're going to be doing over the next few years. The benefit's going to be that that's going to have greater amounts of community facilities, which is going to be really, really good for the young guys and girls and all the suburban footy teams, cricket teams, soccer teams, you name it, who make Albert Park their home.
Is that a difficult conversation to have with local residents to convince, your constituents, your local constituents, that there is a long-term benefit?
I think from the long-term benefit, possibly yes, but I always adopted the approach that you never need to convince people. You've got to work with them. We would occupy Albert Park, and they still do, obviously, with Travis Old and the team there now, occupy it for a build, and a very complex build that's only getting bigger and bigger over many, many years. But you've got to work with the people there to make sure you can have coexistence. And I think people actually enjoy walking around the lake with their dogs, or riding their bike, or having a run in the early stages, and seeing this massive pop-up event, which is the biggest pop-up event in Australia, catering from about 130 to 140,000 people on race day. One of the intangibles that major events do so well is provide civic pride and livability to the people of Victoria. And whilst there might be some people who complain, the thing that always galvanised Melburnians is to say, bugger off Sydney or bugger off Adelaide, these sorts of events are going to be here. And that's why we love the parochialism of major events in Victoria.
Andrew, one of your great legacies was when you left, you'd secured a long-term deal with the Victorian government to lock in the Grand Prix for Melbourne. How satisfying was that, and how challenging was it?
Well, there's a heck of a lot of competition for Formula One events around the world. I mean, the Concord Agreement, which is the agreement that exists between the FIA, the governing sporting body, Formula One and the teams, says that there's a maximum of 24 events per year. It might be 25, but they adopt 24 these days for logistical challenges. And so there's only, it's a bit like musical chairs. There's only so many chairs around that, and everyone wants a new event. Madrid's coming on next year. There's competition from the Middle East, but particularly when it came to that extension, there was competition from Sydney across the border, and it was massive competition. Don't get me wrong, they had a real crack. But the Melbourne offering of having it in a CBD location, the proven relationships we have, the supply chain through the hotels, the airports, the traffic and transport, the police emergency services, showed that the season opener needed to be in Melbourne as opposed to way out in Badgerys Creek. So I think the right decision was made. It's a show of commitment from Formula One. It's a show of commitment from the Victorian government. And importantly, what it shows is that Formula One, as a draw card for tourism and visitation, is one of the best going round, because, Olympic Games are a one-off. Commonwealth Games are a one-off. FIFA World Cups are a one-off. Formula One and MotoGP are an annual event, and Formula One is the biggest event going around annually.
And this to max too, because we know that the Shaheens own their track at Tailem Bend, and the Foxes at Phillip Island for the MotoGP. So how challenging is that to get the mix right between the commercial aspect, the community pressures of developing some infrastructure, and maybe the upside in a property sense?
Well, there's a couple of examples around the world where you're getting the development of major events at circuits that are privately owned. A great example would be Phillip Island for MotoGP, but Circuit of the Americas is probably the biggest one. A guy called Bobby Epstein owns that just outside Austin, Texas. It's 1,500 acres and it's used year round. Now, if you commercialise these and make them the centre of industry around automotive industries and technology and the like, well, then you can start to build it. But it's a very, very long-term play. Here, the tendency, and in Formula One, the tendency is now to move to street races. Madrid is a street race, Miami, obviously, Vegas, Singapore and Melbourne, even though we're a hybrid, are street races. And so you use that investment of government monies to bring the attraction of tourism and visitation so close to the city. And that's the way it works, and works very successfully.
It's an interesting contrast because you've got some tracks around the world, like a Yas Marina, for example, which has been entirely bespokely designed around Formula One with the whole infrastructure around it, commercial, residential, retail. So we've got that hybrid version, as you called it, which is a little bit of permanent infrastructure, which is used by the community. But one of the things we don't get to do in Melbourne is build a lot hanging off that particular facility and all the things around it. So I wonder whether you think there's an opportunity to build more. I know there's a big announcement recently of another $350 million investment in and around the track to improve facilities. But do you think there's more that could be done to try and bridge that gap between the permanence and impermanence of the Melbourne race?
I think in a park location like Albert Park, the ability to do it is probably limited unless it's ultimately going to have really good and strong commercial benefit for the clubs and the community. And I say commercial benefit in a manner that says utilising it for sporting clubs year round, for Parks Victoria activities, for incorporation of change rooms and facilities, for the huge amount of growth that's existing in men's and women's sport in Albert Park. I don't think there's a big ability to have additional function centres and the like, although I'm sure there's going to be benefit of having functions in that pit building facility. But, we're unique in that it's a pure parkland setting, whereas you can get those sorts of investments, and the draw card, another example, not nearly as new as Yas Marina, would be Silverstone, although an old airfield and started in 1948. You get that draw card of industry around there, and you're getting an epicentre of activity in the same way you also get at Bahrain.
Yeah, well, certainly that opportunity as well. And there's a sort of irony, I think, as well, where because of the current environment and planning environment, that if you wanted to build a new track somewhere in Victoria or in New South Wales or anywhere in the country for that matter, you'd struggle so much just because of the bureaucratic pain that would get you to be allowed to do it in the first place. Something like Phillip Island, I dare say, would not be able to be built from scratch if it wasn't there already.
Most definitely. They have about 240 days of track activity, but most of those are centred around low noise emissions. It's very rare, and it's only on set days that you're allowed to have high decibel outputs. MotoGP, Formula One wouldn't go down there, although every now and then they might have a demonstration. Supercars, GTs, those sorts of things exceed those limits. So it'd be extremely difficult. You can't do it in places in Australia, and I think it's going to be very, very limited to be able to doing that in any centralised location. There's a lot of pressure on Sandown, for instance, but it's a great ability to have, supercars racing in the relative centre of town.
A slight aside, you made a cameo in Drive to Survive, is that right?
Yeah, that is a big slight aside, but yes, a cameo of about 2.5 or 3 seconds that, we spent 45 minutes in front of the cameras looking after a COVID cancellation, but my only cameo on Drive to Survive was handing out some free tickets to someone to get into the paddock while Otmar Zafner walked past. But I think if you ever wanted to watch it, it was the start of episode 2, but I'm the only one in the world who probably knew it.
Oh, that's great. Andrew, you weren't too inactive after you left the Australian Formula One race and the Grand Prix Corporation. You were straight onto the board at the Western Bulldogs. Tell us a little bit about your input there. The Whitten Oval Precinct, $77 million upgrade, combination of local, state and federal government funding. That must have been challenging to get that right.
Yeah, it's... To get investment in AFL facilities in suburban Melbourne, you really do need to have that combination of state, federal and club monies. And the facility out in the Mission Whitten Oval out in Footscray has been there. It's been the home of the club. It's a a part of the community. It houses now the Western Bulldogs Community Foundation. It houses facilities associated with local basketball associations. There's childcare, and more the investments that you get in AFL land, Punt Road and Richmond's facilities would be a great example. They need to be catering for the community, and the facilities out at Mission Whitten Oval do cater for the community in a very, very big way. And it's a credit to the predecessors from an administrative point of view that they were able to garner that level of commitment from a state and federal point of view. But you've always got to be putting that level of investment. It might be a big number, but it's just going to get bigger and bigger in the future. And if you can create it with the right level of community offering, like the pit buildings, I'm told, will have when it comes to community sports facilities, then it is a great legacy. I played very bad amateur footy down in Albert Park when the old roads were there. There wasn't even a circuit, although they did have their first racing there, David, in 1953 in the opposite race direction. But it was, in technical terms, a very, very crappy place to play footy. Probably went with my footy standard. But now the whole upgrade of Albert Park is the same as the upgrade of a Melbourne Olympic Parks area. And we love that in Melbourne because it brings people to this city and they get used year round.
Do you think there's an increasing opportunity for private or purely private investment to get into the space? You're seeing it more and more in other parts of the world where landowners are building new stadiums, putting new teams and things in the said new stadiums, building precincts around them. And it's not a model that we've really seen in Australia yet, but do you think there'll be the opportunity for that to happen more in Australia, or do you think it's still going to rely on that sort of state and federal funding?
I think ultimately, if you're looking for a total ecosystem and getting a return on your investment, then you need to have greater use than just motorsport. You've got to have tourism, you've got to have visitation, you've got to have business investment, you've got to have hotel accommodation. So if you've got that long-term vision and the ability to actually get people and get businesses coming to a location, then astute investors will see it's a very, very long-term, probably a real estate play. In the short term, you don't make money as a private investor out of hosting a Formula One event, but governments around the world see it as a real draw card from a tourism and major events perspective. And that's why the city circuits that have a level of public infrastructure there, but then the further government funding to have the event coming to their location is the right thing to do from a tourism point of view.
You were juggling so many balls in your role as CEO of the Australian Grand Prix Corporation. Reflecting back, what was the most difficult aspect of your job?
It wasn't the most difficult, but it was one of the most challenging, and we set ourselves to do it in the same way that Craig Tiley sets his team to do it at the Australian Open, is that the world doesn't stand still. There's better events every year, and as a city that only hosts, the only city in the world with a Grand Prix and a Grand Slam tennis tournament, we needed to raise the bar every year. That meant innovation, that meant improving the facilities. We're a temporary facility, or, the Grand Prix circuit in Albert Park is a temporary facility, yet caters for about 12,000 corporate meals a day, 46,000 grandstand seats, 140,000 to 130,000 people coming along. So you've got to benchmark and you've got to compare to the permanent facilities that Melbourne has. So the biggest challenge was making sure that we just got better and better and better. And that's what makes Melbourne such a great place from a major events point of view, because it's the end-to-end service about when people arrive in the city, they go to the event, they go to tourism locations around the state, and then they go off somewhere else. And if you can create that lasting memory, that was the thing we wanted to do, because as a 4-day event, we just needed to get them back there the next year.
And if there was one or two things you would have done differently, Andrew, what would they have been?
Well, I would never have had a night race. A lot of people talked about that. It was not the place for a night race. Singapore does night races unbelievably well. Other locations do it well overseas. I wouldn't have done that. I think the one thing that I could never control, but getting an Aussie on the podium was one of the things that I thought was going to happen this year in 2025. Yeah. And the weather gods and a little bit of a slippery tarmac at turn, I think it was 11 coming into turn 12 for Oscar Piastri, meant that we're all going to have to wait another year. But they were probably a couple of the things that, in a jovial manner, I would have loved to have achieved. But the rest of it is the legacy of the event, what it's done for Melbourne, and the fact that now people recognise, after probably pretty tough start for Formula One's time in Melbourne, that Formula One has a spot here in Melbourne and it contributes greatly to the state's economy.
What do you think the impact of Drive to Survive and Liberty Media getting involved has been on Formula One generally, and also the perception of Australia?
Well, Liberty Media came along and purchased Formula One from, wasn't from Bernie Ecclestone. Everyone thinks that it was just Bernie's own business. I mean, yes, he created what we know Formula One to be, but he ran it on behalf of a private equity business, CVC Capital Partners, out of, I think, Luxembourg. But when Formula One got sold to Liberty Media, Chase Carey came in. He'd been Rupert Murdoch's right-hand man. Ross Brawn was the man charged with actually making the racing more competitive, and a guy called Sean Bratches came in, who had 27 years at ESPN as head of sales and marketing. So when they came in, the first event that Sean came to was Melbourne. They had a good look at things. We had a lot of the stuff that they wanted to do: city location, entertainment, food, hospitality, and a great buzz and environment. But they knew they could create something, and they knew that they had something quite special. And they created what everyone now knows to be Drive to Survive. There's no doubt Drive to Survive has helped grow the attendances around the world, but Melbourne has to deliver against that promise, because a lot of people would come to Melbourne and the event having only seen Formula One on Drive to Survive. What they had to do was walk away saying, that was what I expected. And we already had that with Glamour on the Grid, the Melbourne Walk, the hospitality, the music, the entertainment, the off-track vibe, and a beautiful setting. So it was delivering on the promise, but Drive to Survive has been unbelievably fantastic. It's changed the demographic, it's changed the attendances, and it's got the helmets off the drivers and made them world heroes.
Is it because it makes them, it's unvarnished? You see the real drivers, their real personalities, and the relatable bits to their I suppose the mystique of Formula One.
That's exactly right, David. I mean, getting the helmets off. They used to just have their helmets and standing next to the cars. They're a great bunch of young guys, and getting them to show their raw appeal is exactly why we love the variety of football players we have in the AFL or the A-League, or the men and women who represent Australia in the Olympics, because you get to see their either humbleness or their brashness or their arrogance and just their raw personalities. And so what Formula One did with Drive to Survive is part of that entertainment approach.
You're also involved with karting, and karting is obviously a very important entree into the world of Formula racing as well. So how do you see that progressing over time, and particularly in the local context where young drivers that have talent really struggle to raise funds to be able to race at the top level? Do you see that improving over time?
I don't see the challenge for funding improving any time, because it just gets more and more demanding to get drivers through Formula 3, for starting off in karting initially, then going into open wheel ranks in Europe, and then Formula 3 and Formula 2. I mean, it might be in round figures, €500,000 per season to get your son or daughter a drive in Formula 3, and then it's about $1.5 million in Formula 2. You only have to look at karting in Australia and the Australian Karting Championships, and we've got two young girls, Ava and Joanne Ciconti, who are going up through the ranks in Formula One Academy and racing in the women's series at the moment, and two young guys who I got to meet through the Grid Kids program that we had at Albert Park. And Jack Doohan was a karting championship champion. Oscar Piastri was, but young Brad Madgeman just podiumed for the first time on the IndyCar undercard just this weekend in Indianapolis, and USF 2000. He got third, starting 11th, and a young guy called Lewis Francis is racing in open wheel categories in Europe, as is Ava's brother James Anagnostiadis, and he's doing well in karting. So it's expensive. You've just got to have the talent, and Karting Australia is producing that talent, and that's why I love it. And that's where the infrastructure needs to also get better and better, because you can have karting tracks dotted around the place, and they are beautiful community facilities. We just need more of them in rural Australia.
You've touched on it with some of your answers, but if you were giving advice to, say, a second-tier sport in Australia, trying to combine infrastructure with local and state government support, benefits to the community, but also benefits to business and private investment. What would your formula be like? I know it is particular to a sport, but do you have a view on that?
I think the key thing is that any sporting club, whether it's a soccer club, a cricket club, a football club, or a go-karting club, becomes a community asset. It's participation for young guys and girls. It's the parents doing volunteer roles and entering the ranks of officials, and motorsport relies on volunteer officials. It's the pride that young go-karters get when they're acknowledging their sponsors and so on, and that's, you only have to look at the way Oscar holds himself. That's as a result of the lessons they learn through community sport. So there's a great role that state governments have to play in getting these community facilities to be gender-neutral facilities, to have male and female change rooms, to make them inclusive and safe environments for young boys and girls who are coming up and playing sport. And a great opportunity, Albert Park, at the extreme end, is to make sure that the new pit buildings are catering also for community sport, because for 51 weeks a year, that's going to be their role for community sport. And if you can get those same sorts of usage out in the rural Australia and metropolitan cities, then you're on your way to getting better community sport and a more vibrant society.
Well, Andrew, we've covered some territory. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the home ground. You've given us a great insight on the Grand Prix Corporation, but also other aspects of sport.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I wish you a lot of success, because Formula One is one of those sports that combines technology, sponsorship and business, and it does it very, very naturally, and it's been a part of it since it was created sort of 75 years ago. So thank you.
Oh, it was amazing to hear from Andrew just how critically important getting that events calendar right for Victoria really is. It's been a game changer and a really long-term vision and investment. So it's amazing to think about how that could be applied towards other sports around the country.
And how about the pressure to innovate? That was the big takeaway from me, knowing that the Grand Prix could never stay still for one season. Is that what you got out of it?
Oh, absolutely. You cannot rest on your laurels, and you can just see how quickly others are going to come behind you and have a go. And hearing how New South Wales was really pushing for it, it reminds you of how important it is to have people like Andrew on your side trying to make sure the event stays in Victoria.
Yeah, and I reckon the connection between community and big business and government, he really explained that nexus perfectly, didn't he? Even with the Western Bulldogs and what they've gone through with the Whitten precinct.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about some of those other private facilities around the world, I'm always inspired by hearing those stories and how you can create a precinct out of something that becomes a core for a new community.
Yeah, look, I've dealt with a lot of CEOs of major sporting organisations in Australia, and I think it was just so relatable. Andrew Westacott, I've known him for a number of years now, but he's been there since the beginning of all the protests to the growth of the Grand Prix, and it was brilliant to hear his oratory of his 17-year career.
It was very, very, very lucky, and a great first guest for the podcast.